Что такое советская власть?
Be clear here, not confused. I'm a socialist.
Chile is rich. Only the people are poor.
As long as they're working class, you'll have a communist party.
What's that book I got? The Russian guy? Stalin. I got that.
Fidel Castro support our struggle to the hilt.
It is impossible for capitalism to answer the needs of the American people.
If I am a revolutionary, and you're going to have to keep on saying that.
And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
We are bound to transform society. As far as crushing the party, it's impossible to crush the party because the party is one with the people.
There's capital versus labor. Because there's always conflict.
You don't mean exactly peace talks, you mean capitulation, surrendering. That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean.
We know that what we are facing here is actually American imperialism and not only Israel.
The pattern of development in our society has been consistently to deprive the working people of the capacity to make choices.
There is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
Are we seeing like the collapse of the empire?
Is that white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere.
And the crisis in the capitalist world has been deep.
La lucha armada es el único camino para la liberación.
But that's all right, because we said even before this happened, and we're going to say it after this, and after I'm locked up, and after everybody's locked up, that you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution. Bye.
Hello. I'm Matthew Hunter, obviously joined by the great, the legend, Dr. Gerald Horne. First off, thank you, Gerald Horne, for giving me the time and the opportunity. Unfortunately, I was not able to make your lecture here in LA. I was very much under the weather. I hear some of my party comrades were able to make it out, so I'm happy they were. But again, thank you for giving me your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Obviously, it's not your latest book because you're such a prolific writer. You have another book out, but last year you published Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Now, I might be predisposed because I'm in LA, I'm in the party, but this was my favorite book last year that I read by far. And even though it was a very long book, I mean, I breezed through it. It was fantastic. But I have a ton of questions coming out of it. And so I have about 5 or 6 questions, and we'll try to get through them as fast as possible. I know you don't have a lot of time, and that's okay. In your work, you discuss the period of armed struggle in the U.S., the 60s into the 70s, as a response to centuries of enslavement, apartheid, and state violence. You also highlight the importance of legal and mass defense with figures like William Patterson in the 1930s, through the Smith Act trials, and obviously Angela Davis as well. What do you see as the key mistakes made during this period of armed struggle, and what material conditions led those certain groups to take up armed struggle at that particular time?
Well, with regard to your latter question, you've already sketched the reasons. That is to say, state violence in the first instance. The LAPD, as you know more than most, has a justifiable reputation for violence. As I tell the story, there was a perception in the LAPD ranks that they were understaffed. For example, even today, I think that the force constitutes about 9,000 or so. Back in the day, it was 7,000 or so. By way of comparison, New York City, with a larger population but a smaller area to patrol, had about 37,000 officers or more in the ranks. And therefore, the LAPD felt that they had to engage in a kind of draconian deterrence. That is to say, to make every encounter that particularly Black people had with the force to be memorable, so that the word would be circulated that you do not want to cross the line into, quote, illegality, unquote, because you may not make it back to the land of the living. I think that that was a major trigger for picking up the gun. But of course, there are other issues as well. Mass incarceration, for example, the crisis of everyday living, which in many ways is a lineal descendant of being descended from an enslaved population and then being subjected to a horrific Jim Crow. The reasons were countless. Now, with regard to eras, as you may have gathered from this book, I apply some of my reasoning and historical excavations of slavery going back to the 1500s to this current story that deals with the period mostly from the 1960s and 1970s going forward to the present day. In other words, as I tell the story, the United States has been a settler colonial regime that helps to explicate the genocide inflicted upon the indigenous population. That is to say that the United States in its history is not far distant from what is now Zimbabwe, what is now Namibia, where you had the first genocide of the 20th century, 1904 to 1908, visited upon the Herero and Nama people, not far distant from Algeria, which had a French settler population leading to a bloody conflict culminating in independence in 1962, not to mention the giants of settler colonialism, speaking of South Africa and Kenya. And of course, I could go on to talk about historic Palestine and Israel, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc. And that's an important concept because my position is that settler colonialism historically has been undergirded and underpinned by class collaboration, particularly amongst the settlers. If you look at my book on the 16th century, for example, you'll find that when London first got into this nasty business of sending settlers across the Atlantic, in this instance in the 1580s to what they called North Carolina, it was a heterogeneous mixture of various class elements, declassed elements, shopkeepers, workers, lumpen elements, all sponsored by the 1%, but all determined to uproot the indigenous and with luck and pluck, being able to drag Africans kicking and screaming across the Atlantic to work for free, leading to mutual enrichment. And as I tell the story, the enslaved population, and of course, the Black population in the United States is heavily descendant from the enslaved population, has been forced to engage in class struggle. That is to say, malingering, uprisings, arsons, attempted killings of enslavers, joining with Native Americans to uproot the settlers, joining with foreign invasions, such as during the War of 1812, when the United States tried to seize Canada. And in return, you saw Africans in Washington, D.C., joining with the Redcoats to basically burn down the White House, sending President Madison and his girlish spouse, Dolly, fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse. So the long and the short of it is that class struggle and class collaboration do not mix very well. And what I tried to suggest is that that particular concept was not altogether grasped. And as I say in the book that you made an oblique reference to, my most recent book, African Americans and the New History of the United States of America, I suggest that one of the many reasons why Black people have been subjected to so many atrocities, not only because of our unwillingness, reluctance to support a settler revolt in 1776, not unlike the settler revolt in Algeria a few decades prior to now, and that that lies close to the heart of this oppression and persecution to which we have been subjected.
You know, you're speaking of class collaboration. with settler colonialism. You've written that the ruling class has historically deployed fascist tactics against Black communities while keeping bourgeois democracy for the settler classes. And in a recent article you published with Anthony Ballas, you made a reference that like Trump is like a neo-fascist, so to speak, coming from like historical and ideological context. Does the nature of internal colonies and like settler colonialism in the U.S. make it almost uniquely predisposed to fascism developing nowadays?
Oh, I think so. The United States is going through some head-spinning changes nowadays. I just gave a radio commentary where I mentioned that listening to Canadian broadcasting, they had a very intriguing discussion about a possible U.S. invasion of Canada, military invasion, and then minimally trying to drive this northern neighbor, in some ways the fifth or sixth largest economy on planet Earth, into an economic ditch, not unlike what has befallen Venezuela, for example. I mean, this was not necessarily envisioned as recently, perhaps as 3 or 4 months ago. I've been using this metaphor that in the North Atlantic community, you have many of the leaders undergoing what I call a collective nervous breakdown. However, I'm going to have to find another metaphor, because after the speech by J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President at the Munich Security Conference, where he tossed aside the idea of confronting Russia or China and pointed the German hosts in particular into bending the knee to the so-called Alternative for Germany party, which euphemistically has flirted with fascism. After he spoke, the organizer of the conference came to the podium and burst into tears. I mean, I kid you not. It was almost like he was having a collective nervous breakdown at the prospect of contemplating the meaning of what J.D. Vance was saying. And so when you have a U.S. administration seeking to point Germany in a neo-fascist direction, when it's talking about, or at least the Canadians think that they're talking about, a military invasion of their country, when you talk about the U.S. administration engaging in settler solidarity with the former apartheid rulers in South Africa, seeking to put pressure on the African National Congress, South African Communist Party government, because they passed a law that basically mimics the laws in this country concerning eminent domain, that is to say, laws that allow the state to take property from those who supposedly possess it. In this case, the European minority, as a legacy of apartheid, still controls a significant disproportionate percentage of the land. And Mr. Trump, supposedly anti-immigrant, then says that he will open the door of the United States to these Afrikaners, these Europeans, who are fleeing supposedly South Africa. But of course, they're not fleeing because they have a good deal. They have a better deal there than they will ever get in this country. Footnote, however, that you cannot separate that latter point from the remarkable presence of refugees from apartheid in the inner circle of Mr. Trump, starting with first buddy Elon Musk, David Sachs, the AI and crypto counselor in the White House, who, of course, is a refugee from apartheid, Peter Thiel, who kickstarted J.D. Vance's political campaign, not only had roots in Johannesburg, but in South Africa and illegally occupied Namibia. Joel Pollack with Breitbart News, a comrade of the ultra-right, roots in apartheid South Africa, bruited as possibly the next U.S. ambassador to his erstwhile homeland. Rolap Botha, a name you may recognize since his lineal descendant was the last foreign minister of apartheid South Africa, Pete Botha. He, speaking of Rolap Botha, is a leading venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, perhaps the leading venture capitalist in Silicon Valley. And so, given all that I've just laid out, yes, none should be overly shocked nor surprised by the fact that the womb is fertile with regard to the possible birthing of a unique kind of U.S. neo-fascism.
In the book, you also critique CPUSA for its inability to like fully grasp with the realities of settler colonialism, and that creating this vacuum along with state repression for the new left to come in, but the new left sort of had some eclecticism, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Why do you think the old left, so to speak, was really unable to grasp with settler colonialism, class collaboration, and why was the new left eclectic about those matters, so to speak?
Well, with regard to the former, unraveling the United States is not easy because, number one, not only were there so many poor Europeans who crossed the Atlantic and did well, which creates a basis for opportunism, a basis for overlooking, believe it or not, genocide against Native Americans, for example. In my Texas book, I tell a story of how the Cherokees, who once controlled the southeast quadrant of North America, the state of Georgia and North Carolina, for example, that they sought to assimilate, including Christianity, including sedentary agriculture, including enslaving Africans. But they still had to go, oftentimes swept out of their mansions, and with Europeans, poor Europeans, oftentimes moving into their mansions, just sweeping the floor and taking over. And then, of course, after the U.S. Civil War, you have the construction of these land-grant universities that are still with us, particularly in the Midwest, where the sons and daughters of settlers were able to get education. The sons and daughters of settlers were the professors and the administrative staff. My ancestors were not allowed. And I think that those sorts of emoluments create a material basis for a certain kind of opportunism, for example. And then there's the further problem, which I mentioned in another interview the other day, which is that we depend upon various comrades and various nations to give their analysis of the history of their country. So therefore, understandably, we depend upon the Cubans to give us an analysis of the Cuban Revolution, the importance of 1959, etc. And I think that many in the international community were dependent upon U.S. analyses for analyses of the United States of America. But the problem was that the analyses of the United States of America, in my opinion, were not altogether penetrating. And so it reminds me of Vice President Dick Cheney during the Iraq War when he was vice president. So he would feed misinformation to journalists. So, for example, Judith Miller of the New York Times about Iraq's capabilities. And then he'd go on the Sunday talk shows and say, well, as the New York Times said, and then he's basically quoting misinformation that he fed to a journalist. And so it's been difficult because many of the revolutionary forces, they depend upon the U.S. analysis and then their respective revolutionaries. And then people in the United States say, oh, okay, revolutionaries abroad are echoing our line, so there must be something to it. But one does not have to be a historian to question basic fundamentals. For example, in 1776, there were thousands of enslaved Africans, mostly alongst the eastern seaboard of North America. By 1861, there were millions, and it becomes difficult to mount this hypothesis, this thesis that 1776 was the seedbed of abolitionism, because if the number of enslaved Africans goes from the thousands to the millions, and you call that abolitionism, I'd hate to see what a pro-slavery project would look like. Likewise, in 1776, as noted, the settlers occupying the eastern seaboard by 1861 had moved all the way to the Pacific, uprooting the Mexican population, not to mention countless Native American nations poised to cross the Pacific, which will be the subject of a future book of mine, and seized Hawaii, an independent kingdom, for example, the 50th and presumed final state. And so the United States is not an easy puzzle to solve. So I'm sympathetic to those who were not able to solve it. And then the same hobgoblins that hobbled what you call the old left were similarly afflicting the new left. That is to say, the legacy of misinterpretation of the history, which then involves the inability or difficulty in grappling with right opportunism and left sectarianism, with the new left oftentimes ensnared by the latter more than the former, and some of the communist comrades more ensnared by right opportunism than left opportunism or left sectarianism. So I'm sure some of your listeners may say, who is this guy? You know, he's making all these pronouncements, which is a fair assertion. But all I ask is that you look at the evidence, quite frankly, and that you ask yourself the fundamental question, which is, after all we know about 2016 to 2021, culminating on January 6, 2021, with an armed insurrection, and the fact that the Tangerine Tyrant is able to return to office in January 2025, 75 million votes accumulated, I mean, the international community demands answers. So you can quibble with Gerald Horne, fair enough, but provide some answers as to how we have found ourselves in this pickle. Please give me some answers. I'm willing to yield if I hear better answers.
In the book, I was kind of surprised that you didn't delve into the shifting policy of the party on the Black Belt Thesis, or the expulsion of Harry Haywood. Especially since he was very friendly with Cyril Briggs, from my understanding as well. And Cyril Briggs is a major figure in the book. And in Black Bolshevik, Haywood kind of centers that removal of party policy on the Black Belt Thesis as this departure from the party on Black liberation, and that opened the door. What are your thoughts on the party's shifting policy on the Black Belt Thesis? And do you think that the Black Belt Thesis has relevance today in terms of analysis or for organizers?
Well, with regard to the former, as evidenced by citations, this book is akin to Russian nesting dolls. That is to say, it's based upon previous books. In my book on Ben Davis, Black Liberation, Red Scare, Ben Davis and the Communist Party, I dealt with the changes in the thesis, the Black Belt Thesis, Harry Haywood, etc. And so I didn't feel the need to repeat what I'd said in that book. I just cited that book, and folks who are interested can turn to that book and see what I have to say. For example, with regard to its possible relevance today, my own opinion is that I'm open to discussing and debating that question. I told a group of younger activists some months ago that at a certain point in this century, I think that there'll be the equivalent of Lancaster House talks in London. Recall that in the late 1970s, the settlers in what is now Zimbabwe and the African resistance movements, they met in London, London being the original colonizing power, to debate what the settlement would be with regard to what eventuated as Zimbabwe. I envision a process whereby the U.S. administration, whatever it may be, along with independent Native American nations, because footnote, I think Harry Haywood and a number of the other comrades could have done a better job in teasing out the Native American question and their pre-existing claims to this territory, but that's another question for another day. But I envision all of these forces meeting in London, working out a new settlement for what is now called the United States of America. And of course, if they had not succeeded already, I expect the representatives from Hawaii to be at the table as well, because of course there is a credible movement in the archipelago that sees Hawaii as an occupied nation, for example. Footnote, you may want to ask why Harry Haywood and some of the comrades were not necessarily seeing Hawaii as an occupied nation. I mean, they come to statehood in 1959. A lot of these folks were still alive. In fact, I deal with that in my book, Fighting in Paradise, which deals with Hawaiian communists in the archipelago. And so this is a long-winded way of saying that once we get to London for these Lancaster House talks to work out a new settlement for the United States of America, I don't think we should necessarily take off the table the idea of a black belt nation. Perhaps, believe it or not, I may not be around, but others, such as yourself, might determine that that is something worth debating, or perhaps they'll say that it has been overtaken by events, as they say. So, in other words, I don't toss out that thesis altogether.
On that similar note, in terms of like a contentious like debate nowadays, the concept of Chicano nationalism and self-determination, including ideas like Aztlan, has been very contentious for left spaces. Some view it as a form of settler colonialism, while others see Chicanos as an oppressed nation with indigenous roots. Where do you stand on analyzing Chicano nationalism, and how do you like navigate these particular debates as well? Because it's very similar to the Black Belt thesis, where it seems to be back in the conversation between left organizations and leftist activists as well.
Well, without repeating myself, I would make a similar response that obviously the war of aggression, 1846 to 1848 against Mexico, was an unjust war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was supposed to have guaranteed rights on this side of the border for folk of Mexican ancestry, like many treaties negotiated by Washington, it has not been observed. And when you have a treaty that's not observed, it obviously exacerbates tensions. It heightens sensitivities. And I think all of us should be sensitive to the concept of Aztlan. And in fact, you may have noticed that on the program I host on KPFK Los Angeles, commentators oftentimes refer to the Golden State as occupied Mexico to this very day in 2025. But once again, I think that as our revolutionary process matures, that is to say, I think we're in the foothills of the maturation of this revolutionary process. But as it matures, I think we'll gain deeper insight and deeper meaning to the point where we get to London to negotiate a settlement that we may determine, a la Hawaii, that this land should be returned to Mexico. We may determine, I mean, folks have been mentioning, with regard to what I said about Canada, you know that in British Columbia, due north of the state of Washington, they have suggested that the Pacific Coast states join Canada, for example. And I see that as a result of the flux that we're going through right now, the right wing should not have a monopoly upon developing and devising different geographical configurations, like, taking over Canada and making it a 51st state, which I see to be ludicrous, although I think it does open up opportunities for the progressive movement in this country to ally, as we should have been doing already, with our friends across the border, and perhaps pushing a mutual agenda of sanctions against the warmongers in Washington, putting them on the back foot to our mutual advantage. But to return to the thread, once again, I see this question of Mexican-American nationalism, Chicano nationalism, the concept of Aztlan as something worth putting on the table once we get to London.
And for sort of the last real contentious debate question, so to speak, because it's one I see a lot in terms of left spaces, is the role of the settler working class. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of comrades that kind of discount settler working class. They bring up the labor aristocracy, bring up settler colonialism and class collaboration, and kind of say that the settler working class is inherently or too predisposed to reactionary tendencies. So building coalitions, revolutionary coalitions with settlers, is almost a non-starter. What do you sort of land on the role of the settler working class in this revolutionary process? I know Walter Rodney, when he talks about certain classes, I think he's talking about the petty bourgeois class, and I forget which country, he talks about them having a dual revolutionary and reactionary characteristic, that they have both. Both are at the table. Do you see that as the case with the settler working class in the U.S., that they have this sort of natural dual tendency of revolutionary actions, but also a deeply reactionary tendency due to settler colonialism?
Well, there's something to that, but I would say that I think it's an overreach. I think it's going too far to say that settler descendants of the working class should be shunned altogether. I think that's a bridge too far. If there had been those in the 1930s who took that position, I doubt that the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, would have been organized. And of course, they were organized and made a breakthrough with regard to organizing the auto workers, the steel workers, the rubber workers, etc. At the same time, we would be purblind if we ignored the fact that if you look at the construction trades in New York City, for example, that those unions were in many ways sort of racist job trusts, where the Euro-American skilled workers would try to pass down their membership card to their sons, for example. And some of them in their charters had white-only clauses, for example. And it took militancy on the part of groups like Fight Back, which was this group organized by Jim Houghton in New York City, that began to have sit-down demonstrations at construction sites that helped to crack the ice and open the door to a degree for the admission of Black workers into some of these skilled trades. Although anybody who's gone through a construction site of late must be struck by the absence of Black workers in the skilled trades, for example, in terms of iron workers, hod carriers, carpenters, electricians, etc. And similarly, as I've said many times before, if you analyze voting patterns, yes, we should throw overboard and discard the current language you see in the corporate media, which equates the working class with the settler working class, basically, and then ignores it as a multiracial, gendered class, to put it mildly. But at the same time, of course, when the Tangerine Tyrant gets 77 million votes in November 2024, and states like Pennsylvania and Michigan break for him, if we're going to be true analysts, we have to look at the racial breakdown of who's voting for this character. And we have to be honest with ourselves, because if we're not honest with ourselves, I can tell you that it's going to be very difficult to gain traction with the Black working class, which, as I said, has a legacy of class struggle. All you're doing is alienating them and chasing them away if you act as if some of these ugly realities don't exist. So, of the questions you've asked thus far, I think this is one of the simpler ones to answer. That is to say that obviously there are negative trends based upon historical precepts that I've articulated at the top of our interview and that I've developed at length in my books dealing with the early history of settler colonialism going back to the 1500s. But at the same time, I mean, people do evolve, classes evolve, even capitalists evolve, at least some capitalists evolve. And so we can't be locked in to ancient arguments, for example. We have to be open to new realities, for example.
Speak on new realities, but also sort of echoing the period that your book is talking about. In recent years, we've seen an increase in indigenous militancy. And even just very recently, what was it, like last week, we saw the Black community in Lincoln Heights arm up and drive out Nazis and fascists in their neighborhood. With obviously the election of Trump and the contradictions that entails, are we coming up to another period of armed struggle, so to speak? You talk about, in the 1960s and 70s, that was, the first time since I think you said like 1865 that we saw organized Black masses fight, shoot back, is the quote you use. Are we close to that again? Are the machinations at play, so to speak?
Well, if that is the case, as I've been stressing, I think that the folks who are advocating that should have an analysis. That's one of the lessons of the book on the table. An analysis of the correlation of forces domestically, a class analysis, who will be our allies, who will be our antagonists, above all, an international analysis. If there are those who are leaning in that direction, I trust and I hope, they don't have to tell us publicly, but I trust and I hope that they've been in touch with our comrades in Cuba, for example, that they've been in touch with our comrades in Quebec, for example, that perhaps they've tried to rally international support, for example. So that would be my only cautionary note, so to speak, with regard to a replay of the 1960s and 1970s. And even in the interregnum between 1865 and, say, 1966, when the West Coast Panthers were organized, you had spates of armed resistance. I even talk about that in the book. I mean, for example, the Deacons for Defense in Louisiana. I even talk about how in the early 1960s, they were visiting Northern California and influencing folks in their direction. This is before 1966, I should mention. And I mentioned that in the South in particular, there have been a long tradition of folks maintaining weaponry in their homes. After all, people were hunters to a certain degree. You had people who were military veterans who had learned about weaponry thanks to the U.S. military, for example. And as I also talk about in the book, in the 1930s at the Lenin School in Moscow, admittedly in terms of training U.S. comrades to go fight on behalf of the Spanish Republicans in the 1930s, but still People were trained in guerrilla warfare. People were trained in constructing Molotov cocktails, trained in urban street fighting, for example. I go on at length with regard to that particular issue. So once again, if folks are leaning in that direction without seeming overly self-absorbed, I hope they look at this book. So that, because one of the reasons I wrote this book was to try to excavate what some of the mistakes were, which led to people being driven into exile, people serving long prison sentences, people being assassinated, killed by the authorities, etc. And as the saying goes in Washington, the second kick of the mule is not necessarily educational. You should learn from the first kick of the mule, for example. And let us hope and that particular lesson is absorbed.
Dr. Horne, that's all my questions for today. Yeah, I really appreciate this. I don't know if you can see it, but I have about 9 or 10 of your books here. And I actually got into it before I got into the party or anything like that. I was in the boxing industry, and I found your book, The Bittersweet Science. Mm-hmm. And that got me onto you, and that it sort of slowly got me into communist theory and history as well. So I just want to say thank you for that as well. It changed my perception of the industry I was in absolutely really fast. And just again, thank you for the time. Your work has been highly impactful, not only to me, but I know to many young comrades out there. The Dawning of the Apocalypse, Colonialism, those 2 books are, I think, must reads for anyone that's trying to understand the history of the U.S. So again, just thank you for the time.
Thank you for inviting me. And send me the link once you throw it up.
I will. Thank you so much.
All right, good luck to you.
All right, bye.
Be clear here, not confused. I'm a socialist.
Chile is rich. Only the people are poor.
As long as they're working class, you'll have a communist party.
What's that book I got? The Russian guy? Stalin. I got that.
Fidel Castro, support our struggle to the hilt.
It is impossible for capitalism to answer the needs of the American people.
I am a revolutionary, and you're going to have to keep on saying that.
And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
We are bound to transform society. As far as crushing the party, it's impossible to crush the party because the party is one with the people.
There's capital versus labor. Because there's always conflict.
You don't mean exactly peace talks, you mean capitulation, surrendering. That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean.
We know that what we are facing here is actually American imperialism and not only Israel.
The pattern of development in our society has been consistently to deprive the working people of the capacity to make choices.
There is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
Are we seeing like the collapse of the empire?
That white person that you see calling himself a liberal is the most dangerous thing in the entire Western Hemisphere.
And the crisis in the capitalist world has been deep.
La lucha armada es el único camino para la liberación.
But that's all right, because we said even before this happened, and we're going to say it after.